I'm Richard Fontaine, CEO of the Center for New American Security, and it's a real delight to welcome everybody to the 19th annual CNAS National Security Conference. The theme of the conference this year is America's Edge, which is fitting for a time in which the United States is facing a rapidly changing and challenging global security landscape. More than ever before, the United States needs to develop bold, innovative approaches to meet these national security challenges, and I hope that the sessions that we'll have today on the stage will contribute to that effort. We're holding our conference this year at a moment of profound transformation and a good deal of uncertainty, both here in Washington and in the world. War, of course, endures in both Europe and the Middle East. Tensions with China shape America's relations with Asia. We're witnessing dramatic departures in U.S. economic policy, especially on trade. New defense approaches may be in the offing as well. And there are dramatic advances in technology, especially artificial intelligence, and all that coincides with broad geopolitical shifts and the advent of a new administration. Some of the assumptions that for a long time undergirded a lot of U.S. foreign policy are being today re-examined, redefined, redebated. It was a general consensus, for example, for a long time that there's an international order that exists and benefits the United States, that spheres of influence, especially if dominated by hostile powers in Eurasia, pose a significant threat, that the best way to keep the peace is strong alliances underwritten by the forward deployment of American troops abroad, that an open international economic system underwritten by free trade is the best path to prosperity for Americans, and that having a bias in favor of democracies rather than autocracies is the best way to ensure the survival of freedom both abroad and at home. I think, to say the least, all of these assumptions today are up for grabs, or at least they're up for debate. And behind it all is a question about how should the United States maintain its edge in an unpredictable, fast-changing world. So today, much of the conversations that you'll hear will be focused on some ways of exploring answers to those kinds of questions. Our leading voices who we brought here today will be engaged in a series of interactive sessions and discussions, so I encourage both our in-person audience here and our online audiences to participate in them. We'll begin in just a moment. Before we do, I'd like to just take a moment to recognize our conference sponsors at the visionary level, Invenergy, at the elite level, Northrop Grumman, and at the premier level, American Rheinmetall Defense, Boeing, Cisco, M&C Saatchi World Services, RTX, and Western Digital. Thanks to all of you and to our institutional donors and to our individual supporters for making today possible and making the kind of work that we do at CNAS possible. To engage in the discussions today, please follow us on X, also known as, or formerly known as Twitter. You can do that at CNASDC. And tweet using the hashtag CNAS2025. You can join the conversation and submit questions by using the chat on our official conference website, and you can watch the proceedings online at cnas.org/live. So, to kick off the day's deliberations, I'm super pleased to welcome to the stage David Sanger, who will be joining us in just a second. David is the White House and National Security Correspondent for the New York Times. He's author of the book New Cold Wars, was the first writer in residence at CNAS, and David has been covering U.S. foreign policy and national security issues for decades. We're going to take a chance to open the proceedings by trying to explore the moment we find ourselves in a conversation here. So David, please join me up here.
Thank you. Great.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for being here. It's hard to believe that you were the first writer-in-residence at CNAS, and we're now on our 19th National Security Conference
And
here.
it's amazing.
So this organization has come a long way, and you've been part of it, so thank you for being here. I thought maybe we could start and just by taking a kind of a step back from the issues of the day and looking kind of big picture question. In my comments there, I sort of noted it feels like we are in a major moment of upheaval in the world and a lot of rethinking about fundamental national security assumptions in Washington. Does it feel to you, does it look to you like we're in a fundamentally new era in national security and foreign policy today?
Well, first, thanks for having me. I was, as you said, I think one of the first, if not the first, of the writer-in-residence group, and it enabled me to write my first book. So I'm deeply indebted. It was a real startup organization back then. It was Kurt Campbell and Michelle Flournoy, and then a group of young people around them, all of whom went on to go run the U.S. government, except I went back to my same old desk. So, but it's really great to be here. It does feel entirely new, and that's because there is this sense of disruption in which, for one of the first times we can really remember since the end of World War II, we are the disruptor. We're not the only disruptor. China's done its share. Russia's obviously done its share as well. But usually the role of the United States during that time was to sort of come back and provide a stable center that others gathered around to go deal with whatever outbreaks there were. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, various wars in the Middle East. And now it's got a very different feel. And I think that feel, Richard, comes from a sense that we really did not have in President Trump's first administration, that he is out to disassemble the understandings of the post-World War II order and to replace it with something that he hasn't defined. And that's the amazing thing, because we know what it is that this administration wants to take apart. We got a big dose of that with DOGE. We've gotten a big dose of that with his steps in dealing with Europe, certainly with the tariffs. But what we haven't gotten yet, and maybe we'll get it when there's a new national security strategy, maybe we'll get it in a series of deep and pensive national security speeches by the president, but I'm sort of not holding my breath for that series to start. But what we haven't gotten is his vision of what he wants to replace it with. We've heard a lot of people speculate. I lean toward he'd like a spheres of influence kind of approach, where the only people he's got to deal with are basically Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and maybe MBS in Saudi Arabia on family holidays. But we don't know for sure that is indeed his vision.
So let's shift to one of those and talk about China for a moment. It feels, in a way, almost ages ago, but it was as recently as January, where it felt like in Washington we would wake up in the morning and start talking about China, talk about China all day long, go to bed talking about China, do the same thing the next day. So much of what was happening in the world was seen through the lens of U.S.-China competition and potentially conflict. Functional issues, technology, the economy, all of this was seen through China. And the administration, with the significant exception of tariffs and a couple of other things here and there, has been, so far, it seems to me, much quieter about an overall China policy, which in a way is strange because the Biden administration's approach to China looked much more like the first Trump administration's approach to China than it did the Obama administration's.
That's right.
Right? And the sort of mantra was China is the greatest long-term challenge of the United States, the only country in the world with the will and capability to kind of overturn the international order and so forth. And in the meantime, just over the past couple of months, there's been some rather newsworthy developments that, again, don't seem to have gotten all that much attention. But China practiced this amphibious landing on Taiwan, complete with these ships that had bridges that go out for landing troops. It conducted live fire exercises off the coast of Australia. It It claimed a new feature in the South China Sea for the first time since 2006, almost 20 years. So what's going on? Why the relative quiet on China policy compared to the way it was before, and also relative to what China seems to be up to?
Well, I don't think it's because any of the fundamentals have changed. China's doing what China's always done, and if anything, as your list suggests, is accelerating it. And the only thing I'd add to that list is their nuclear expansion, their nuclear weapons expansion, appears to be ahead of schedule. If any, when was the last time you ever heard of a nuclear program in any government that was defense program that was running ahead of schedule? So my sense is that, in fact, they're doing exactly the things that we were waking up and thinking about. What's happening is that the Trump administration, even if they're waking up and thinking about it, is not necessarily talking about it. Part of the reason for that is that tariffs have blotted out the sun. If you listen to President Trump, it would be, you might emerge thinking that our trade imbalance with China, which is big and growing as they have overproduced way more than their domestic economy can pick up, was the only issue that we faced with them. When Secretary of Defense Hegseth went out to Shangri-La this weekend, I was interested to read his speech, because if you closed your eyes and covered your ears and just read it, you could have imagined the Biden administration giving a very similar speech.
Yeah, I had the same exact thought.
He did say that a conflict over Taiwan could be imminent. I'm not sure I would definitely put that time frame on it, but fact of the matter is we don't really know. What he didn't do was explain again what the strategy going forward was, which is, I think, what everybody at Shangri-La was kind of looking for, which was beyond tariffs. How do you go do this? And what worries me about the tariff strategy is that the only way you're going to do comprehensive approaches to China, whether it is export control, technology control, making sure they're not getting the most sophisticated chip-making equipment from the Netherlands, making sure that they're not being able to route around our controls, is that you do it together with your allies. And so having thrown the same sanctions on all, or tariffs on your allies as you have on your adversaries, it's not clear to me what his plan is for having them all work together. The second thing he didn't do is, and this kind of surprised me, having hired some people, including Bridge Colby for the Defense Department job, whose focus has been in rapidly shifting us from Europe to the Pacific, he didn't really discuss that either. And I'm not sure that looks like a strategy that they feel they can afford to go do at a moment that there is so much chaos in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and so forth.
So one of the things the Secretary of Defense did say, which again resonates, frankly, not only with the Biden administration, but going all the way back to the Obama administration, is that Asia is the Department of Defense's primary theater. They want stronger U.S. allies that are spending more on defense, and they want them to be knitted more closely, both allies and partners with the United States. So all of that at one level is just a statement in a way of policy continuity. On the other hand, and you just touched on this, how do you do these things? It's the case today that there are not one but two carrier strike groups in the CENTCOM area of responsibility. Right. There was made some news when there was the redeployment of missile and air defense assets from the Indo-PACOM AOR and things like that. And of course, the United States remains a global power. There's things going on in Europe and the Middle East, among other regions. And so I guess two questions on that. One, do you expect the same sort of challenges, which seem, at least to me, somewhat structural when you have a global power that's trying to focus quite correctly its foreign policy on the Indo-Pacific because China is there. But the other question is about the way that the administration does or doesn't see the interrelationships between what happens in Europe, for example, what happens in Asia. This is sort of I think an article of faith of the Biden administration that outcomes in Europe were going to influence outcomes in Asia, right? So if Ukraine loses, the next would-be aggressor, including China, would be more emboldened to try to do something in Asia. I don't know whether the current administration sort of sees the inter-regional linkages like that, or if they see that as just kind of something to not really deal with. Do you have a sense on those two issues?
So a couple parts. First, on the difficulty of getting the pivot together, I mean, they wouldn't be the first one, right? No one's written this more thoroughly and in more detail than you have. But the pivot seems to be sort of stuck in the same old issues along the way. I think the Biden administration made some progress in that regard, but certainly not probably as much as they want. My own view is if you're going to be a global superpower, and we're not really sure this administration has that vision in mind, but if you're going to have influence around the world, you can't choose. You have to be able to be in all of those theaters at the same time. And yet, there is this great reluctance to be seen as influencing events, particularly in Europe and Ukraine. And as you say, this odd kind of separation, as if what happens with the Russians and Ukraine isn't being watched every moment by Xi Jinping as he does that calculus about Taiwan. Now, my own view is the Taiwan calculus is as hooked up in the future of Taiwan semiconductor as it is in the future of Ukraine. And I did a book last year called New Cold Wars, in which I spent a lot of time in Taiwan and at Taiwan Semiconductor, and I think I emerged from that thinking they're probably not going to take Taiwan or attempt to unless they're certain that they can reproduce the capability of Taiwan Semiconductor on the mainland. And so that's, I think, one of the big step functions in all of this. I'd love to see an integrated strategy, but I think one of the reasons that this administration is reluctant to give us one is that there is a big portion of the MAGA base that basically says we don't want to be doing interventions around the world. And if you don't want to be doing interventions around the world, you don't want to be putting together a strategy about how Ukraine influences what happens in Taiwan.
So one other area of kind of interconnection that seems to get less attention now than it did even a few months ago was my colleague Andrea Kendall-Taylor and I have called it the axis of upheaval. It's the sort of set of relationships that has at least spawned 1,000 names among think tankers and writers, right? So this is China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea working together more closely. In the previous administration, I think more or less saw this as kind of a fact of life, one to be dealt with through getting together more closely with allies and partners and things like that. The current administration has been relatively quiet about this. Every now and then there might be a suggestion that it's actually possible to split, maybe split Russia from China if we kind of got the right deal and ended the war in Europe. Obviously there's negotiations going on with Iran and things like that. So maybe something less than just a fixed group of countries that is oppositionist and revisionist. But how do you see this group of powers working together, and then what at least seems to me a little bit of, at a minimum, a rhetorical shift in how we think about this?
Well, first of all, the coming together of Russia and China, and as you say, Iran, North Korea into that axis, and maybe others will add, is, in my view, and I argued this in New Cold Wars, probably the biggest single geopolitical change of the past number of years. If you think back to the Iran negotiations of a decade ago, which I was sort of covering day to day, back in the days when they were civilized enough to hold the negotiations in various European capitals where you ate really nicely as you were covering all of this, instead of sort of securing themselves away in corners you can never find these days to go to it. But back in those days, the Russians and the Chinese were involved in the negotiations, but they were sitting on the US-Europe side of the table.
Right.
And I think nothing sort of more vividly illustrates where we are today, that if those negotiations came back in a multilateral way, and they haven't been, they've been Steve Witkoff and Foreign Minister Arachi together, I suspect the Russians and the Chinese would be sitting on the Iranian side of the table. So how do we think about dealing with this each day? The first is, as you suggest, the administration has not talked about it much. It could be because it's too complicated for them to go deal with while they're getting started. It could be that because the president himself seems intent on rebuilding the relationship with Russia, they think that over time they actually could peel them back. I don't think they can, Richard, and I'd be happy to be argued on this point. But Xi Jinping and President Putin have met more than 70 times. Xi has called Putin his best friend in the world. There are not many people who tell you Vladimir Putin's their best friend in the world. They clearly are doing military exercises together. They have a deeper and deeper technological run. Do I think they fully trust each other? Of course not. But it was amazing in covering the Biden administration how President Biden moved from telling me at the end of his first year or so, no, I don't think these two countries can ever deal with each other, to the answer he gave me at his, what turned out to be his last press conference, which was after the NATO summit last summer, when he said, yes, we have a strategy for separating Russia and China, and I'm not going to tell you what it is. I actually think it was a mistake for them not to publicly explain what that strategy was in the Biden administration, because at least it would give us something to compare to what President Trump is or is not doing on this truly vital combination.
But yeah, well, or it's just hard to imagine what an effective wedge would actually look like.
Yeah.
Because I mean, the notion that the United States is going to be closer to either Russia or China than either is to each other starts to boggle the mind as soon as you think about what the practicalities of that might require and how that would actually mean, and especially given the mutual benefit they get. And then, of course, you know, the idea of doing a reverse Kissinger is misguided if for no other reason than that was an exploitation of the Sino-Soviet split. We didn't create the Sino-Soviet split.
No,
we exploited
that's right.
a rift that had already occurred. And if we had to sort of get between the Soviet Union and Mao in the 50s or something, good luck, right? You know?
Right. I did, at the end of Henry Kissinger's life, the last 5 years of his life, I did a series of interviews with him for what became the Times' Kissinger obit, which I think ran at 10,600 words, which is pretty long, even by New York Times long obituary
But for 100
standards.
years.
Yeah,
you
right.
know, I
On a
mean,
year-by-year
word per
basis.
year.
That's right. It was just,
ratio is okay.
It was just 100 words a year. I think even he doubted that the conditions existed now to go do what he was doing during the opening to China. That said, it would be fascinating to watch, to try to figure out whether Putin himself thinks it's worth keeping the illusion up that the US could pull him away. Because if he could keep President Trump busy in that thought, well, with just a little more, you might pull us back from China, it could keep that relationship going.
I'm going to move to questions and weave some in from the audience if there are questions here, and then we've also got some that have come in down here. So let me take a quick look and see if there's anybody in the audience here who wants to put in a question. Otherwise, I'm going to take one from here. So one that has come in is on basically technology and the fact that a lot of people don't like the term artificial, or the AGI, right, artificial general intelligence, but pick whatever term you like for extremely capable AI models that are performing at and maybe beyond human levels in distinct cognitive domains. Okay, whatever that is. That seems quite likely to arrive during the current administration's watch. And there's a pretty fierce debate, but not a huge amount of activity around, do you legislate something on this? Is there how do we deal with, on the one hand, allies and partners who we want to have the benefits of these things, and this is a foundational power, element of national power now, including a military power. We want to the degree we can, certainly deny some of the benefits of that to hostile governments. So all of these things are starting to crest at the same time. I think in the current administration, there's a real emphasis on, well, then we'd better as hell not slow down. We shouldn't do anything that would sort of lock ourselves down and let the Chinese move forward, or anybody else for that matter. How do you see the cresting of this phenomenon on the current watch, given what is or is not the sort of policy-making environment around AGI and AI in general?
Well, first, the really interesting question is if we could fast forward to the CNAS conference 20 years from now, and they bring you and me back in the old, for Old Timers Day,
They
right?
wheel me in a chair.
Right. And do the old Chinese leaders thing, yeah, right.
That one magnifying glass.
Right. As we are trying to answer each other's questions, the really interesting question is, when we look back at artificial intelligence, emergence of AGI, or Donald Trump as the most fundamental disruptor of this period? Right. And I can't answer that question right now. The fact that the two of them are working together is, or working in parallel, is a really interesting factor. I went with Vice President Vance to the AI summit in Paris. It was the first big speech he gave. I learned two things from that. The first is never ride in the back of Air Force Two. It's so cramped that it's still got the little metal cigarette ashtrays built into the seats.
I have ridden in the back of Air Force Two and remember those very cigarette things and had the same thought.
Right, yes, so not exactly.
Less comfortable than one might
If you could have
imagine.
gotten the Omanis to give us anything, I would argue it should have been a new Air Force Two, right? The second thing I learned was they are not interested in hearing the word guardrails. Mm-hmm. When you talk to the Biden administration, their view was we need to have each large language model get reviewed by what they set up as basically a board within the Commerce Department that reviewed the models and tried to make sure that you couldn't build a nuclear or biological or chemical weapon from stuff you could get at CVS, right? And that seemed to be the direction we were going. And the major AI companies were kind of okay with that because their view was let them regulate it, gives them the liability issue on this. Vance's view was we're not going to sit here and talk about AI and equity. We're not going to sit here and talk about AI and safety. We're going to plunge forward because the Chinese are going to plunge forward. And we have to win this conversation. I can't tell you how many times in that speech he used the word U.S. domination of AI, which is, I don't think, a word you would have heard in the previous administration. There are some who are arguing, including the founder of NVIDIA, that our regulations on AI and on chips are just driving the Chinese to do more on their own. My own view is they'd probably do that. They're feeling as vulnerable in the supply chain as we are. Mm-hmm. And then the question is, can you design a smart system that brings all of your allies into your AI-dominated territory? And I haven't seen the strategy for that yet. You hear David Sachs, who's running AI and crypto policy, talk about it a little bit on his podcast, but I'd like to see more.
A couple more questions that have come in here. So one is about the role of investigative journalism, something you may have an opinion on.
Yeah.
How do you see the role of the press and how investigative journalism plays a role in shaping, one, both foreign policy in the United States, but also the public understanding of security threats apart from what the administration is doing on this day or that day?
So, there's been no greater commitment, I think, that I've seen at the New York Times than to investigative work, not only based in Washington and New York, but now investigative teams in Europe and Asia and so forth. And there's really no journalism you want to engage in that isn't investigative at some level. I worry about two things. The first is somewhat diminished impact, because we hear from readers, and you see this more generally, less from New York Times readers than others, that people feel so bombarded by the news or disheartened by what they're seeing in political debate, or alienated by the separation and polarization of our parties, that they're sort of tuning out. And consuming investigative news means actually engaging with it and understanding what it's telling you. I mean, just in the Trump administration, if you think about the different lines, whether they really are shrinking government, seems not, given the bill that's in Congress now for the budget, whether or not there is a guiding strategy to going after these pockets of expertise, whether it is the National Science Foundation or basic research or Harvard or whatever, whether or not the president and his family are enriching themselves by their embrace of crypto and other arenas. And then, of course, a lot of investigative work that has nothing to do with the Trump administration. And I worry that we sometimes can overwhelm readers. My second concern is there are not enough news organizations that can afford to do this right now, particularly in the local journalism level. You're seeing the United States lose news organizations at an astounding rate. It was wonderful to see the Baltimore Banner, a new operation, win a Pulitzer this year. But we need a lot more generation of new journalistic organizations, and it's going to have to be on a different model, because clearly the economic model that sustains the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal doesn't necessarily work at the local level.
All right, one last question for you, and then we will let you go. What is the set of issues or the region or the place or the potential crisis that we in the national security community are not paying enough attention to? I mean, my own nominees might include, for example, there was people noticed obviously, but India and Pakistan just fought a war.
Yeah.
They both have nuclear weapons. That's generally not a positive development.
Yep.
If you want to scare yourself, you can start to play out what that might look like if they don't stop at some point in a conflict like that. The other would be North Korea, which we focused a lot on North Korean troops in Ukraine, but there's also North Korea on the Korean Peninsula, which we used to worry about a lot, including its nuclear program.
At a moment that the U.S. is pulling some troops out of South Korea.
Right. So what would be your nominees for areas that not just the national security sort of community writ large, but I don't know, a place like CNAS is trying to think further down the line about potential events and how the United States might best deal with them that we should be paying attention to?
So first, you're talking about basically the problem of strategic surprise out here. And I hope that's a group within the intelligence agency that's working overtime. I look at advances that we've seen coming out of the Ukraine war including the remarkable attack on the dual-capable bombers on Sunday by Ukraine, where $600 drones wiped out $100 million nuclear-capable bombers. And I asked myself, okay, I get why the president wants to spend $175 billion on a Golden Dome, whose technology I think we're not going to see in 3 years, or certainly for that low a price tag. But I wonder whether or not there is an equal effort to go figure out how we would defend ourselves against the kind of strategic surprise the Russians woke up to just the other day. If I was looking for ways to go get at the United States, that would be high on the list. I worry about the defense of our space assets, something CNAS has done a lot of terrific work on, and I rely on that a lot, because defeating the Golden Dome is most efficiently done in space. We haven't seen Putin yet launch the nuclear space weapon that we thought a year ago might be imminent. But boy, that would be an easy way to get around that. India, Pakistan, certainly the case. The fact that you're going to see nuclear technology get so much cheaper worries me a good deal. And then the last thing that worries me, and it goes back to work I did at CNAS and have done since, we've let the AI debate overrun the cyber debate. And the very fact that China got into our telecom systems, that China got into our utility systems, and they're still not out. And we are responding to this by diminishing the number of cyber defenders in the US government, I think really opens us up to a huge vulnerability.
Well, I know I feel better.
Good. That's my role in life, Richard, is to make you feel better.
All right. Well, look, that was fantastic. Thank you. That's a great way to set the scene for all the other conversations we're going to have today, many of which are going to touch specifically on those, including hopefully some ways to deal with some of these issues. David, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Great
Really
to be
great
back with all
to
of
have you.